I'm Dominic Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we hear the latest battlefield and diplomatic updates, and then we hear live from the Foreign Office after the visit of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 10th of September, 2 years and 204 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, Brussels Correspondent Joe Barnes, and Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant. I'll start with the updates as normal. Before I do, though, I just want to mark our thanks to you. We have been deluged, thousands and thousands, and I mean that, thousands of messages of love and condolence for David. Email, Twitter, every social media channel you can mention. You know, it's been fantastic. I am going through everyone. We're all going through everyone. We all get them. It comes to all of us. The Ukraine pod address goes to all of us. So we are reading them. I mean, I was about to say we've been overwhelmed, but that has a sort of negative context. We've not been overwhelmed at all. We've been quite the opposite. I don't know if there is an opposite, actually. Is it whelmed? I don't know if that's a thing or not. But anyway, we've been whelmed. We've been absolutely whelmed by your love and support. And we are reading through all of them, responding where we can. I mean, it's going to take a while, folks, but thank you so much. And as I said yesterday, we'll do something more organised in due course with some form of messaging. But we do appreciate it. We really do. It was a tough day. It still is. It's a tough time. It's not going to get easier. It's just going to become a new way of being normal, I suppose. But it's lovely to know that you're with us and that David touched so many of you without ever having met you as he did to us here. So thank you. Right, the news. Russian attacks across Ukraine killed at least 4 people and injured 20 over the past day. This comes from regional Ukrainian authorities reporting earlier today. Ukraine's air defences say they shot down 38 of 46 Shahed-type drones launched by Russia overnight. That comes from the Air Force, Ukrainian Air Force. 14 drones over Cherkasy Oblast. That's right in the centre of the country. Some suggestion they're trying to attack the sort of water infrastructure. There's also reports I've seen of a potential or possible poisoning of the river north of Kyiv that flows into Kyiv. There's a lot of dead fish and various reports I've seen there. Something odd has happened there, but we don't really know. Keep an eye on that. Now, 3 of the drones fired at Ukraine last night flew off, did their own thing, as we've seen quite a number of times now in recent months, headed away from Ukraine. Not sure where they ended up. And Russia is also thought to have launched an Iskander-M ballistic missile from occupied Crimea. That was that last from Kyiv Independent reporting. Speaking of the Kyiv Independent, thanks guys. They published a lovely tribute to David yesterday. So do go and have a look at the Kyiv Independent, their note on David. Now, back to the war. Russia's defence ministry claiming today its forces have captured the village of Vodyan. That's about 5 km northeast of Vuhledar, 30 km southwest of Donetsk city. So in the sort of southeastern bit of the Donbass, if you like. Now, that reporting is also from the Kyiv Independent. They say they can't verify the claim, and a Ukrainian military spokesperson refused to comment on it. Elsewhere, there's been very, very limited movement. Nothing much in the vicinity of Pokrovsk in the Donbass, mostly small grinding Russian advances, although there's also reporting of some regained ground by Ukraine in that area. Up in Kursk, there's the news there, mainly from Russian mill blogger community, is that Russia has recaptured a little bit of land east of Suja. So I ask you, what's the bigger news? That Russia's recaptured a bit of land, or that thousands of Ukrainian troops are still camped out in Mother Russia? It's very easy to say, I haven't done anything. They've not been pushed out yet, lads. They're still there. Speaking of Russia, let's go inside Russia. Russia's MOD says its air defences shot down 144 Ukrainian drones overnight across 9 regions, 20 drones alone over Moscow, or the Moscow region. Moscow Regional Governor Andrei Vorobyov said debris from one drone damaged at least 2 high-rise apartment buildings in the southeast of the city in the early hours of today, setting several flats on fire and killing a 46-year-old woman. That reporting comes from Al Jazeera. If it was 144 drones, we think that is probably going to be one of the largest Ukrainian strikes against Russia of the war so far. In Moscow, the Vnukovo, Domodedovo and Zhukovsky airports, all the big airports, were closed briefly. Civil Aviation Authority Rosaviatsia said 48 flights diverted to other airports. Now, the Russian MOD also said 72 drones were intercepted in Bryansk regions overnight. That is close to the northern border with Ukraine. That's the bit that sort of where Ukraine, Russia and Belarus all meet. Governor Alexander Bogomaz described the attack as massive, but said on Telegram there were no casualties or damage. Another 14 drones were said to have been intercepted over Kursk, 13 over Tula Oblast, that's kind of halfway between Kursk and Moscow, and 25 more over other parts of the country. That came from Russian MOD. Now then, next story. Ukrainian officials have continued to warn that Russian forces are increasingly using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Ukraine Support Forces Command said yesterday that Russian forces used ammunition equipped with dangerous chemicals and chemical agents 447 times last month. Kyiv says that Russian forces are using K-51 and RGVO gas grenades to deliver munitions containing banned chemical agents, and are also using unidentified chemical compounds. That comes from that reporting is from the Institute for the Study of the War, the US-based think tank. Now, Hamish DBG, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, regular on the pod, both talking, and I can see you lurking there, Hamish. Hello, thank you for your lovely words yesterday, Hamish. Hamish has spoken and been published widely on this subject. Most recently, he was speaking on Saturday on television about the alleged use of banned chemical substances by Russia. You'll be able to find that still on social media. But Ukrainian officials and a Russian military unit have previously reported instances of Russian forces using chemical agents in Ukraine that are banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention, to which Russia is obviously a signatory. Right, that'll do for the tactical updates for today. Francis, let's have a little chat. What's happening on the diplomatic front?
Well, thanks, Dom. The loss of David is in itself a news story around the world today. It was reported on the BBC News last night at 11 o'clock, and the Ukrainian embassy in London released a statement a few hours after our broadcast. They said, and I quote, "We are deeply saddened by the tragic passing of the Telegraph journalist of Ukraine, the latest podcast, David Knowles. His dedication to reporting the truth about the war in Ukraine and his commitment to telling the stories of those affected by it will never be forgotten. Our thoughts are with his family, friends and colleagues during this difficult time. Ukraine mourns this profound loss alongside you." I think David would have been deeply touched by that. Other newspapers and institutions around the world have also paid tribute, including the Institute for the Study of War, the Moscow Times, the independent newspaper banned from Russia, the Press Gazette, the American Enterprise Institute, and, as you mentioned, Dom, the Kyiv Independent, who, having spoken to several of its journalists last night, are deeply, deeply affected by David's passing. As Lillian Bivings, its business editor and regular contributor to this podcast, wrote, David was a crucial part of keeping the world informed about Ukraine. He was a great journalist, but more importantly, a great person who was a joy to be around. Its correspondent, Francis Farrell, well known for its coverage of the front lines in Ukraine, and who's also appeared several times on Ukraine the Latest, added, "It's hard to imagine someone who, through their work and sheer devotion to this fight every single day, made for a stronger antidote to Ukraine fatigue than David." Thank you very much, guys. It's much appreciated. Now, those are just some of the organisational reactions to the news of David's passing, but the real measure of his impact, as you say, Dom, can be felt in the outpouring of grief expressed online. The Telegraph has created the means for people to share their memories of David, with that page being flooded with messages by journalists, friends, but most, I think, which would have affected and pleased David most, people who he'd never met, whose lives he touched. Our own inbox, as you say, was overwhelmed or whelmed with messages yesterday. And for hours, it was just a constant stream coming in from every corner of the world, including from ambassadors and very senior government officials. Not that their role, as I say, would have mattered to David, who was utterly without ego and utterly authentic and empathetic, regardless of who he was speaking to. Suffice to say, we will add links in the show notes to those who want to read some of those messages, and in due course we'll find a way of sharing some of your correspondence. It will also not be the last you hear from David. Such was his productivity. There are still many interviews and reportage we have of his to run. But turning to other news, as I know he would have wanted us to do, another important story took place over the weekend, with the heads of both MI6 and the CIA doing their first ever joint remarks, warning that Russia is waging a reckless campaign of sabotage across Europe and that the UK and US face an unprecedented array of threats, with the entire world order under the most serious strain since the Cold War. Sir Richard Moore and Bill Burns also co-wrote a newspaper article in the Financial Times where they described China as the principal intelligence and geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. They touched on the secret work their agencies are doing to try and reduce the chance of wider conflict in the Middle East, and revealed that MI6 and the CIA were working ceaselessly to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, and underlined the resurgent danger posed by Islamic State. Quote, "There is no question that the international world order, the balanced system that has led to relative peace and stability and delivered rising living standards, operations and prosperity, is under threat," they wrote. They didn't list examples, but said there has been a spate of mysterious sabotage and arson attacks on infrastructure in the UK, Germany and the Baltics, something, of course, we've reported on many times. And the US reportedly foiled that alleged Russian plot to assassinate the chief executive of Germany's leading arms manufacturer. Now, as physical sabotage, there is also, of course, warning of the threat posed to Western democracies by Russian information operations, referencing in their piece the Kremlin's cynical use of technology to spread lies and disinformation designed to drive wedges between nations. As we often say, what we have said there, which is nothing we didn't already know, is less important than who has said it and the circumstances in which it has been said. Evidently, the two intelligence agencies are extremely concerned and want to put on a united front in an unprecedented manner. And no wonder, with yet another example of Russia seeking to foster its own Eurasian security architecture, with its foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, attending the Russia-Gulf Cooperation Council joint ministerial meeting of strategic dialogue in Saudi Arabia yesterday. They could come up with a bit of a snappier title, couldn't they? The Middle East remains, of course, one of the few places where Russia continues to have leverage and clout, so no wonder they want to prioritise that theatre. Now, just finally turning to Ukraine, it has been an open question for some time now as to what exactly the Ukrainian strategy is as we approach November. And in that vein, EFE, the leading news agency in Spanish and the fourth largest in the world, has published an interesting piece from Marcel Gascon, which has led to some comment this morning. In it, he puts forward a hypothetical scenario of what President Zelensky's plan may be, which many are finding quite persuasive. So to quote the piece, "Aware of the lack of good prospects on the front and faced with the risk of a decline in military aid from some key allies, Zelensky is working on a unilateral roadmap that aims to end the war this fall and is relying on international pressure on Russia to achieve peace on terms acceptable to Kyiv. Through small nuggets of information that journalists and analysts try to fit together like a puzzle, the Ukrainian president has been giving details and an agenda that, for now, has its most solid element in a so-called plan for victory. The main point of this plan is to force Russia to end the war. One of the key ways of achieving this will be the success of the Ukrainian operation in Kursk. It seems that the intention behind the Kursk operation was to force Moscow to send troops there from the Donbass to boost morale in the country and perhaps to force Putin to negotiate. In addition to the possibility of an exchange of occupied territories between Kyiv and Moscow, the plan has an economic aspect and proposals on the role that Kyiv should play in the international security architecture. It also includes measures to be taken to ensure that Russia ends its military aggression against Ukraine. He goes on, in parallel with the presentation of this plan to its partners, Kyiv is preparing to organise a second peace summit before the end of the year, to which, unlike what happened at the first edition of this event, held in June in Switzerland without Russian representation, it plans to invite Moscow. From the statements of Zelensky and other Ukrainian spokesmen, it is clear that the aim of this second meeting is for the largest possible number of countries to put pressure on Russia to accept peace on the terms proposed by Kyiv. The effectiveness of this pressure will largely depend on the stance taken by powers close to Russia, such as China and India. Kyiv is courting them persistently, but so far they have not shown themselves willing to use their influence with Moscow to force Russia to withdraw fully or partially from Ukraine, as Zelensky has demanded. So, Mr. Gascon there. Skeptics would say that the removal of Dmitry Kuleba as foreign minister last week would suggest that efforts to try and persuade those countries on the proverbial edge have not been entirely successful. But I am less pessimistic. I think that China, India and others have at least been partially persuaded that an end to the war is in their interests, and crucially one that recognises Ukrainian sovereignty from Russia. Now, that is not a victory, as articulated by many in the West. But no doubt Moscow will have been pushing strongly for the reverse, using all the means at its disposal. And the fact that you have seen the Indian Prime Minister and those very open conversations taking place with China in recent weeks would suggest that there is some progress, I would posit. But again, it all remains to be seen. Staying with Kyiv, we promised last week we'd offer a broader reflection on the reshuffle I just mentioned once the dust had settled. In doing so, I want to quote friend of the podcast, Ilana Morinets, who wrote an excellent summary for The Spectator. As she says, in Ukraine there is a joke, never waste time memorising the names of ministers, they will be replaced soon enough. Zelensky's often desire for firing and rehiring every few months has become a signature of his presidency. Last week was nothing different, with the largest government shake-up since the full-scale invasion began, or, as it turned out, just a reshuffle of the same familiar faces. We need new energy, Zelensky declared, as he instructed the parliament to dismiss and reappoint almost half of the cabinet, 8 ministers in total. Autumn will be important for Ukraine, he said. His team is gearing up for a critical trip to the US this month, where he will attend the UN General Assembly and meet Biden. But when it comes to new energy, Svetlana says, and fresh vision, Zelensky's appointees seem to be the same old crowd, reshuffled between ministries, with one promoted to be his advisor. She concludes, Zelensky's government has been running on fumes after 5 years. It is desperate for fresh staff. But with elections forbidden by the constitution during martial law, the president is left recycling the same names, moving them from the cabinet to the presidential office and back again. Parliament only comes into play when the president needs a vote. His inner circle, led by the influential Andrei Yermak, no longer bothers to share strategy with MPs, who are increasingly sidelined. The tired government apparatus badly needs elections, but ending the war is a priority. Most Ukrainians agree. But meanwhile, Zelensky should be careful about reshuffles. For a country fighting to prove it's on the side of democracy, the last thing Ukraine can afford is to lose its reputation in the Allies' eyes. I think that perfectly summarises the conundrum for Kyiv. And as we discussed at the time the presidential election was delayed, the challenge of governing without an election after a sustained period of time. At least Abraham Lincoln was able to inject new life into his administration in the election of 1864. No such luck for Ukraine, given the challenges we've articulated so often. But that's enough from me, Dom. Lots going on.
So let's go over to Joe Barnes, Brussels. A couple of stories here, Joe. The first one you've got today about European Union spending on defence. And then we'll talk about this story about whether or not Iran has sent ballistic missiles to Russia. It's looking from comments that are coming out of the press conference that Roland's at now, live at the Foreign Office, looking like I think Antony Blinken has suggested they have. But I'll come on to that shortly. But kick us off with what the EU's been talking about, please.
Yeah, let's do missiles after. But yeah, so the European Union yesterday published a big report by Mario Draghi, the former Italian Prime Minister, former head of the European Investment Bank, or European Central Bank, sorry, ECB, and he is credited with saving the Eurozone during the Eurozone crisis of over a decade ago. And he was tasked with basically doing a big overarching report on the EU and whether it's competitive enough to face up to the likes of the US and China. But interestingly, he went into defence and basically warned that European Union governments must spend big on joint defence projects because they can no longer rely on the US for their security. He said EU countries are buying too much of their defensive equipment abroad, which almost 2/3 of that is coming from the US, and failing enough to invest in these joint projects. He interestingly warned the EU that basically national competition between defence firms is problematic, and he said it had weakened Europe's ability to act as a cohesive power. Why is this important? Look, it comes as NATO allies have warned that Russia is arming at an alarming rate and has as little as 3 years or Europe has as little as 3 years before Russia might make an attempt at a European and NATO country outside of Ukraine. There is the shifting focus in Washington towards countering China as the White House's main foreign policy goal. And then you've got the overarching fears of, does a Donald Trump presidency mean that Europe will be less protected by the US because of Donald Trump's suggestion that he would not defend a European NATO ally from a Russian attack if they are not hitting the NATO 2% of GDP spending target? So this is what Mario Draghi had to say in his report. He said, the safety of the US security umbrella freed up defence budgets to spend on other priorities. In a world of stable geopolitics, we had no reason to be concerned about rising dependencies on countries we expected to remain our friends, but the foundations on which we are built are now being shaken. So look, you've got that shift in Washington from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. That's well documented. Started with Obama. Donald Trump accelerated it, but actually Joe Biden turbocharged it. You won't hear a lot about it because of Ukraine, but his main foreign policy goal was countering Beijing. And basically Mario Draghi said in his report, US strategic doctrine is shifting away from Europe and towards the Pacific Rim, for example, in the format of AUKUS. That's that submarine deal between the UK, Australia, and US, driven by the perceived threat of China. As a result, a growing demand for defence capability is being met by a shrinking supply, a gap which Europe must fill itself. So he was saying the EU is collectively the world's second largest spender, so that's the 27 member states together, are the second largest spender behind the US on defence, but it only forks out around a third of what Washington does on defence, and only 10 of the EU's 27 member states, which are also part of NATO, hit the 2% spending goal, as I mentioned. So look, many countries have announced and are doing significant rearmaments, ramping up spending in response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The European Commission has sort of estimated previously that it thinks to basically make sure the EU is defended and protected over the next decade, it will have to spend about 500 billion in cash. But Mr. Draghi has warned it isn't just as simple, or in his view anyway, isn't just as simple as a continental rearmament resulting in huge spending. He said, look, it will be completely plagued by difficulties if the EU's defence industry is not significantly or sufficiently centralised in Brussels. So one of the points he makes is, across the EU's 27 member states, there are 12 types of battle tanks being operated, while the US only produces a single model. So he is basically suggesting that European governments should club together and produce one tank, one helicopter, one fighter jet. You get the gist. He also said, because of the way that basically individual companies aren't set up to sufficiently be scaled up to meet production demands, that if there is a sudden splurge in defence sort of procurement, it would trigger a supply crisis. So he basically argued that, look, you should use greater joint procurement in defence to mitigate the risk of shortages. And he went on to say in his report, This lack of coordination creates a vicious circle for the EU defence industry. Without demand aggregation among member states, it is more difficult for the industry to predict longer-term needs and increase supply. In turn, decreasing its overall capacity to meet demand and depriving the industry of orders and opportunities. So he's basically saying, look, we should overhaul European competition policy basically to make sure that EU defence spending is focused on companies based within the bloc, rather than that money filtering and flowing overseas to the likes of the US, where you think that people are buying Patriots, F-16, well, not F-16s, F-35s. The UK, where we sell them still many, many different weapons and items, they want that money focused in Brussels, which can then basically take on handouts. But I think it's interesting that sort of that narrative is building, that the EU should look at basically turning itself into not just a trading bloc, but also a geopolitical power bloc, where it looks at more areas, these heavy lifting of military, where it hasn't previously looked before, and they've very much remained national competences. But I will stop there on that one, and I believe, Dom, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Just a couple of thoughts occurred to me as you were talking there. I mean, laudable stuff. We've heard this many times before about defence sovereignty and Europe as well. I think, for my money, no pun intended, I think he's barking up the wrong tree there. I mean, yes, he's right to point out that Europe's developed 12 different types of battle tanks. And you might say that they were all, when these programs were first designed, they were all set against the same enemy, a T-72, basically. So you think, well, how did you all come up with 12 different ideas? It's like, well, for various different reasons about your own defence industrial base and so on and so forth. But if you want an easy snapshot of why I don't think this is going to work and why I don't think there will be some pan-European defence industry, just look at the colour of the uniforms, right? Look at the colour of the uniforms for temperate, as in the sort of green trees and woods bit of the world, between the British, the Dutch, the Germans, the French. I mean, we're all expecting to fight in Northern Europe, and we all thought it was a different colour. So, yeah, we couldn't even get our blooming shades of green and brown correct. So the chances of all coming together and deciding on one tank, I think it's for the birds. Secondly, you talk about AUKUS. There's two pillars to AUKUS. AUKUS Pillar 1 is, yes, this future nuclear submarine. All very exciting stuff. I think, I've said before, keep your eye on AUKUS Pillar 2. AUKUS Pillar 2 is going to be research and development between the UK, the US and Australia in high technology. And that takes you straight into, how much of the tech innovation there is going to be fed from information by the Five Eyes Alliance, and that will immediately put it ahead, I would have thought, in time, if nothing else, of anything that Europe might come up with. So again, AUKUS is a benchmark. It's good to think of the EU and all the states coming together and working on very high-tech military applications. But, you're going to have to go some way if you're not also given a little bit of know-how from the Five Eyes. And then it comes down to risk. And I remember when I was serving, used to work with DARPA, the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, trying to, break physics, basically come up with all the latest thing. They prided themselves, and they had this battle every year with Congress for the money. They prided themselves, DARPA, on a 3% throughput. So what they said was only 3% of the money that's ever given to them actually turns into something on the shelf that you can then go and use. And Congress always say, well, that's rubbish. We need more bang for our buck. And DARPA would say, well, okay, if you want more stuff for your money, we'll just go and invent a slightly better photocopier. If you want to reframe physics and invent things like Tinterweb and all that kind of jazz, then you're going to have to be prepared to fail an awful lot. So DARPA prided itself on a 3% through conversion from cash into actual capability. I wonder if the EU can't even decide on what tank and what colour shirt to wear, where are you going to decide how much money you're prepared to fail fast, fail better? How much money are you going to spend failing before you actually get something that works? Anyway, Joe, still haven't had Roland. I think he's in the press conference in the Foreign Office. Now, it looks like David Lammy, Britain's new Foreign Secretary, has confirmed that he and Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, are going to go to Kyiv in the very near future. But he's welcoming Mr. Lammy is welcoming Secretary of State Blinken for, I think, certainly their first meeting, or Blinken's first trip here since David Lammy's been Foreign Secretary. We think they are going to announce some kind of sanctions on Iran connected to ballistic missiles, which we think they are also going to say has happened. Now, there's reporting from the EU that Brussels says it's received evidence that Tehran has supplied ballistic missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine. We think this comes from EU spokesperson Peter Stano, reported in German media outlet DW. Joe, what are you hearing? Where do you think this debate is in Europe at the moment?
The European Union yesterday said that it had received intelligence that Iran had supplied Russia with ballistic missiles. I can never remember how to pronounce it, but it's basically a Fatah or a Faith 360 short-range ballistic missile, satellite-guided. Dom will leave the expert commentary on the missile itself to you. But this is what Peter Stano had to say, a friend of mine. He delivered it to a group of journalists. We are aware of the credible information provided by allies on the delivery of Iranian ballistic missiles to Russia. We are looking further into it with our member states, and if confirmed, this delivery would represent a substantive material escalation in Iran's support for Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. So, and he's basically said, look, we're going to have to get together and we're going to put our heads together and try and come up with some EU sanctions against Iran in relation to the delivery of ballistic missiles. Cast your mind back, the EU has various sanctions regimes in place because of the war and predating that. One of those is in Iran and on Iran for the supply of Shahed-style drones. So this is going to be a slightly new sanctions package. We don't know what it is yet, but it's interesting that we basically got confirmation that this has happened. I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on Hungary coming up, because Hungary is talking about friendships and partnerships with Iran at a time where it criticises its own fellow EU member states for sending weapons to Ukraine, saying that is a warmongering thing to do. So yeah, let's see about Hungary, because support from Hungary will be needed if there is going to be an EU sanctions package on Iran. But yeah, look, it's confirmed. I don't think it's a shock. It's been touted from security agencies around the world for a long time. This is pure speculation on my own sort of part, but I guess that was delayed because of what Iran was planning in Israel. And they finally given up the sort of ghost on that maybe a little bit and have gone, you know what, we're going to give Russia what they have been asking for. We know from the Shahed drones, they actually sent trainers who were based in Crimea to train Russian troops on the system. So we can guess that is going to be the same process. We're probably going to see some Iranian personnel inside Russia, inside Crimea, maybe occupied Ukraine. Don't know where it is going to be, but we will see that ahead of the first confirmed use of these missiles.
Now, Roland, you've just come out of a briefing at the Foreign Office between the new British Foreign Secretary David Lammy and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. I think it's the first time they've met in post as David Lammy's new Foreign Secretary. What have they been talking about and what have they announced?
Quite a lot of stuff, really. I mean, the real headline, I think, is that they've both just confirmed that they have intelligence that Russia has received its first shipment of Iranian ballistic missiles. The British and the Americans have trailed that this is a danger. They say that Russia has now received its first shipment of those missiles. They're likely to be used in Ukraine within weeks. These are Dom, you will correct me, the Fatah 360, I think, which has a range of about 75 miles. Antony Blinken was saying that the point of this is that, okay, that's relatively short range, but it allows Russia to use its longer range ballistic missiles on targets deeper in Ukraine. It adds to their capacity. And they were using pretty strong language about that. They were talking about, look, this is not just a threat to Ukraine, this is a threat to Europe. Iran has to understand that. I'm speaking to you. What's the time? It is 10 to 2 this afternoon and outside the Foreign Office. They say in about 10 minutes from now that we're going to have announcements about UK sanctions, about US sanctions. Those sanctions are going to be against Iran. I understand they're likely to target Iran Air. I'm not sure about the exact nature of that, but I would note that Iran Air, strangely, I didn't know this, they still have landing rights in Britain. And I wonder if they're going to retain that by the end of the afternoon.
You mean the commercial airline, yes. The commercial air carrier? Yes,
exactly. Iran's national carrier. And the other thing off the back of this is that they both they announced that we are going together to Kyiv this week to meet President Zelensky. And that's really interesting for two reasons. The first is they don't usually trail these trips going to Kyiv for obvious security reasons. Usually you find out that they're there officially when they've already arrived, because in case they get hit by a Russian missile or something. They very deliberately stated this, we're going there now, which is very unusual. They're going together. And get this, Dom, this is ahead of a meeting between Keir Starmer and Joe Biden on Friday. So, and the message that both David Lammy and Secretary Blinken gave was quite clear. They said, I don't have the quote to hand, but from memory, along these lines, we are going there to consult with the Ukrainians about what their objectives are, what they need to reach those objectives, and how we can support them. Now, they won't go further from that. They were asked about the big question of, will you let them fire long-range missiles into Russia? They wouldn't go any further on that, but we know that is one of the big questions, knocking around. We know that the pressure from the Ukrainians has remained there. So I wonder whether, I'm not setting it up, I don't know if there'll be a big announcement or anything like that, but I wonder whether that's something that's going to be discussed both in Ukraine and between Keir Starmer and Joe Biden on Friday.
Now, Saturday just gone, I was at the FT Weekend Festival, and the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, and the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, Sir Richard Moore, they were speaking, first time they'd been together in public. Bill Burns, well, they were both asked about this, about the possibility of Iran sending ballistic missiles to Russia, and Bill Burns refused to be drawn on it. I can only imagine the decision, the intelligence must have been there and the decision to sanction must have already been taken, but he was going to leave it up to Secretary of State Blinken, Foreign Secretary Lammy to make the announcement. But when asked, Bill Burns did say any such move like that would, quote, mark a dramatic escalation, unquote. Now, that's quite a powerful statement. Dramatic escalation is not going to sit in a void. It might not necessarily draw a dramatic response, but it can't just sit there empty. Do you think what was announced today is the end of it, or did you get any indication that the US and UK are going to take further action beyond that they've announced today?
Beyond the sanctions, I suspect there may be more coming along. David Lammy used those same formulation. It is a serious escalation, and like the discussion that I've had around this with officials, I'm beginning to get this sense that they're part of this talk, part of this consultation, part of the reason they're going to Kyiv before the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain sit down, is because they want to hammer out like a strategy, right? There is definitely a sense that the West, Ukraine, President Zelensky's had his 10-point peace plan, his pathway to peace, and so on, but there's always been this lack of a kind of a goal when you talk to Western officials, and it's always been frustrating. I get the sense, certainly the kind of briefings we've had, the emphasis they want to get across to us is that, look, nothing has changed on our support for Ukraine. The Ukrainians want to win, and we bloody well want them to win. But, as you and I, Dom knows, all our listeners know, there are these questions that play into this, right? And really the questions, these knotty questions are around things like red lines, I think, and these are not things that are necessarily going to be discussed publicly at press conferences by secretaries of state and foreign secretaries. But we know where the debate lies, right? The reason that the United States has not greenlit long-range strikes into Russia is around the perception the Russians have of what that would mean and how they might respond. So that, I think, remains a really key debate. And I wonder, I don't want to set something up or raise expectations of something, but I do wonder whether there is going to be some shift in that conversation in the coming weeks.
Just finally, Roland, from me, the very strong performance today, as you say, the two foreign secretaries, for want of a better phrase, and you say the two national leaders are going to meet up next week. How much of that is to show a united front regarding Ukraine, Russia and Iran? And how much do you think it's to get over the slight diplomatic frisson recently when Britain said it was going to stop licensing 35 of about 500-ish weapons that Britain supplies to Israel? That was seen to be a little bit of a policy. There was a policy gap between the UK and the US position there that needed to be filled. Do you think some of this today was showing that there's absolutely not a fag paper between them, or was it all about Ukraine, Russia, Iran?
No, there was a lot of stuff. There was a lot of talking about Gaza and so on. Yeah, I think there's elements of that because, of course, there is a special relationship. And whenever you have an American leaders or American and British statesmen together, British and American statesmen together, they have to pay homage to the special relationship. And they duly did it. And Antony Blinken said, I don't like to call it a special relationship. I call it the essential relationship because it's essential to us. And so all the right things were said. And they put a big emphasis on how close our bonds have to be. So, yeah, there is an element of polishing those credentials by both sides. And yet, again, throughout the history of the special relationship since the Second World War, there have always been policy differences that have caused these problems. You go back to Britain refused to get involved in the Vietnam War. There's all kinds of things you can point to. And, yes, at the moment, there's a gap over Gaza, a slight gap, but not a massive one. They definitely sang from the same hymn sheet regarding Gaza and the peace talks, which was very much the message from both of them was that, look, it's high time that this peace deal was done. We're down to the last 10%, a handful of problems, not even a handful of problems, and both of them signaling quite forcefully that they think it's Sinwar and Netanyahu who are now the ones who have to take that forward. And then there is this difference about long-range missiles, right? We've seen the leaks. We've seen how it's being, the Brits have let it be known, or certainly haven't gone to massive lengths to disabuse people of the notion that they would be happy for the Ukrainians to fire Storm Shadows into Russia, but you need American know-how, American kit. It's an American veto. The impression is very, very much, and I think actually, Dom, at that event that you were at with Bill Burns and Richard Moore the other night, I was watching it, and I'm pretty sure there was a question about this, right? Quite a blunt question. You know, Britain would like Ukraine to be able to fire missiles. You say, no, why not? What are you afraid of? So that remains, there are clear sticking points, clear slight differences there, but on the whole, yes, I think you're right. A real effort to show that the special period, great efforts to polish that narrative.
Fascinating stuff. I think that question about long-range policy permissions, the ground is shifting on that. It'd be very interesting to watch that in the next few days. But Roland, thank you so much from the dangerous turf of Whitehall in central London. Be careful coming back from there, Roland. I think the red line is now past £8 a pint, so to take it easy on your way back. But Roland, Oliphant, live from the Foreign Office, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.
Let's now turn, chaps, to final thoughts for today. Francis, can we start with you, please?
Thanks, Dom. Just a very brief one from me to reiterate your expression of thanks to listeners around the world who have shared their thoughts, reflections, memories, and condolences about David's death to us, and indeed we will also make sure that those are in due course passed on to his family, who are very much aware of the sentiments of listeners, being of course listeners themselves. I also just wanted to say as well, thank you to those institutions and outlets who have sent flowers to the Telegraph offices. David's desk is currently a bouquet of Ukrainian sunflowers, and it's a really beautiful sight. So a very short one from me today, Dom, as I'm sure listeners will be pleased to hear given my tome earlier. But I just wanted to say thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts.
Thanks, Francis. Joe, would you like to close today, please?
Yeah, I'll just also a few words about David and the sheer number of messages that I've received from journalists, contributors, just listeners. It just proves and shows what a big part of their lives David had become over the last few years. And I think that is nothing short of incredible. A guy sat in an office in London leaves such an incredible mark. So one listener, Martin Bailey, texted me and asked me to pass on this message, and I'm actually going to read it because he said that he was in tears at Dom and Francis's beautiful tribute yesterday. He says that Martin told me, look, I feel like I practically knew him. However bad the news and however far away from our lives, he connected us endearingly with Ukraine. And I think that is, one of David's real legacies there when it comes to this podcast, that he's formed a few other sort of personal things about David, and one is love for cricket, which is one I share with him. And I remember after we had Jonathan Campion on the pod to talk about his book, The Ukrainian Cricket Team's Last Stand on the Front Lines of the War, David and I discussed how we could organise a game to perhaps raise money for the Ukrainian Cricket Association in the future. David dreamt big. He was looking at visions of walking out at Lord's, the Oval in London, but there was even mention of a trip to Australia to play the game. There was also always discussions in the background about how we strategized to watch England test matches, which once ending with David streaming the match on a work laptop, possibly on a website he shouldn't have been using. It resulted in him being dragged into a security office at Telegraph HQ for a ticking off about misuse of work equipment. We always used to laugh about Francis's tome length updates and the diplomatic updates. And I remember once we were trying to work out what we could do during Francis's vast, terrific monologues. One of those games was an answer chess from David. We eventually did manage to play. But the time that we did decide to play, we actually were cut short and never finished the game because Francis had indeed cut his own remarks short. But yeah, then just other silly things that you always look back at. I now am going to struggle to find someone who is going to help me pronounce the name of sort of tiny Ukrainian villages on the front line, because David was a master at that. And it's sort of silly things like that are going to leave a great void in our lives at work, and the listeners at work had listeners at home sort of listening in, and his expertise and his dedication to making sure things were right. Nothing short of incredible. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get to spend actually more time with David over the last few years. We've known each other because of my sort of the geography of being posted in Brussels. But those hours of sort of text messages every day discussing Ukraine, other things, cricket, etc., will leave a massive void. So yeah, thank you for all your messages. Really does mean the world to us. And yeah, thank you. And yeah, David, rest easy, my friend.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Francis. Watching cricket on work laptops, I'm sure that's not the greatest misuse of work equipment that the security people here have seen. Looking at you, Francis. But yeah, interesting on the cricket. Anyone work at the Wacker? Anyone know people who own the Wacker? Are they going to invite us out with the Ukraine's cricket team? Maybe we should look at that. Anyway, Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.